Hi Year 11, soon to be Year 12, it's Miss Watson here. Very excited that you are interested in taking the English Literature A-Level, and I'm going to talk you through our induction session today. So I would suggest that you make sure that you get a couple of different coloured pens and a piece of paper, or alternatively, if you are listening to this on your phone and you've got a laptop in front of you, you can type it up on your laptop or an iPad or anything like that. You can print the PowerPoint out if you want to and annotate next to it, but it would be really good if you can put all of your notes down, because we will want you to bring these with you when we start the A-Level in English Literature. So please make sure that you make a note of them. And you'll see that there's a little symbol in the corner of the different coloured pens. The slides where they're on, I'm looking for you to probably write something down. So if you keep a lookout for those, but I'll talk you through anything as well. And then just make sure that once you've done everything, you keep it nice and safe, ready to bring it with you. So how does the course for A-Level English Literature look? Well, we have 3 exams at the end of Year 13, so Component 1, Component 2 and Component 3, and then we have Component 4, which is a piece of coursework. So in Component 1, the whole thing is based around drama. It's a drama paper, which means we're looking at 2 plays here. So that just means that you get to go into the exam and you've got your play head on, which makes it nice and easy. So there's no mixing or matching with the A-Level at all. So you will study Shakespeare's play Othello, and you will open Component 1 paper, and there will be 2 Othello questions. You'll pick one, you'll write your essay. And you will also study Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire. In the same paper, you'll find your 2 questions on that, you'll pick one, you'll write your essay. You've got 2 hours and 15 minutes to write both of those. It's open book, so you get to take copies of both of the texts in with you, and that counts towards 30% of the final grade. Then Component 2 is prose, so it means that we're looking at novels. Totally novels, nothing else, no mixing and matching again in this paper. And for that you will study Bram Stoker's Dracula and Oscar Wilde's A Picture of Dorian Gray. There will be a choice of 2 questions on those 2 texts. You'll pick one, you'll write your essay, 1 hour and 15 minutes, done, out of the exam again. It's open book, so you'll get to take a copy of both of those texts in with you. This one is worth 20% because you're only going to write the 1 essay, but you do have to compare the 2 texts against each other this time. You've got to talk about both of those in the same response to the 1 question. Then we've got Component 3, which is all about poetry this time instead. So you will study a selection of poems by Rossetti, and in the exam there'll be a choice of 2 questions again. You'll pick one and you'll write your essay on the Rossetti poetry. And then there will also be an anthology of poems that we will teach you. They are all going to be contemporary, modern, post-2000 poems. And the question for that, you will be given one of those poems out of the anthology, and you'll be given an unseen poem that you won't have seen before. And you will be expected to write your essay comparing the unseen one that they've given you plus the one that they've given you out of the anthology. So again, this is open book. Again, lots of choices. You can pick which question you want to answer. You would have studied nearly all of it beforehand, apart from that one unseen poem. So it's a really, really fair course in that we think they give you plenty of time to answer the questions. 2 hours and 15 minutes to write 2 answers seems pretty reasonable. It's open book for all of the papers, so no memorising quotations to within an inch of their life. And then we have this piece of coursework that's worth 20% as well. And this is entirely your choice. So you will pick 2 texts that you want to write about. You will have to compare those 2 texts, and you will produce a 2,500 to 3,000 word piece of coursework, and that's yours to take ownership over. We will guide you through it, we will give you some suggestions, but it can be something that you're really interested in. And of course it gives you 20% banked before you go into those exams at the end. So that is what the English Literature course looks like. So I'm going to talk you through a few ideas over the next few slides. So hopefully this will help you to have a better understanding of what it is that we're aiming to do at A-Level English Literature. Okay, so you can see here that I've talked about how we've come a long way in society, and we genuinely have. We've made huge progress, but there is still a gap in many areas. And the first one I've picked out is gender. And you can just have a little look in your own time at some of the things that I've put on this slide here. So I'm talking about the gap in pay between males and females. I'm talking about victims of sexual assault. I've got the picture of the Disney princesses and the way that they are stereotyped and the messages that they feed into our society. So take your time, have a look at those, move on when you are ready. On this slide, I'm talking about another gap that we still face, and this time I'm talking about class. I'm talking about wealth, poverty, privilege, and this is really important as well because, again, we seem to have come a long way, but there is still a gap to consider. And you can see in some of the pictures here that I'm showing you this, you can see there's some of the graphs that say if you're born in a poor area, you're going to die earlier, that in recent years the rich have been continuing to get richer, and that they seem to have accumulated a lot of wealth for a small amount of really rich people, and then a lot of people left over are still really struggling. So this is a gap that we still have. On this slide, then we've got another gap that exists in society. Again, we've come a long, long way, but it is still a gap that we have. And this time it's around sexuality. This idea about heterosexuality being the norm and homosexuality still being seen as different. And again, you can see some of the headlines, some of the graphs that I've put on here about people struggling with their sexuality and about how this is still something that we are trying to overcome. And the reason I've put these three things on here about class, about sexuality and about gender is because when we look at the English Literature A-level course, we're looking at how literature perpetuates these ideas, about how sometimes an author consciously and deliberately brings some of these ideas into their text, but how often an author unconsciously brings these ideas in because they are unknowingly influenced by the society around them, that their surroundings are meaning that they're writing a text that often has an issue with gender or has an issue with class or has an issue with sexuality. And we tried to unpick some of those in the A-level English Literature course. And we also sometimes look at how writers try to challenge these issues and whether they are successful in trying to challenge them and present a more equal society or present a version of things in their books and their texts where things are different, where it's not necessarily that heterosexuality is the norm, that men are better than women is the norm, where they try to challenge that and then we evaluate the success with this. So one of the ways that we do this is we look at what's called literary theory. And the first literary theory that I've got on this slide here is Marxism. And you can see that I've got a box where I'm summing up about Marxism for you. Now, I would suggest that if you can't copy and paste or print this out, that this is a point where that little white box might be worth copying down into your notes so that you've got them nice and clearly here. So there is a lot more to Marxism than this. This is a very brief, in a nutshell, summary for you. But essentially, these are the key things that a Marxist critic does when they look at a piece of literature. So whether that's a play or a poem or a novel, they are looking at that literature and they are trying to see if they can identify some key ideas in it. So Marxist criticism looks at how the bourgeoisie oppress and exploit the proletariat. Now, the bourgeoisie, they are the wealthy in our society. They are the upper class. We have that still existing in society today, and we would look at a text and we would see, do those members of the bourgeoisie oppress and exploit the proletariat? So the proletariat being the lower class in society, the less privileged, the less wealthy. And we would try to identify where we can see that happening, where those poorer people are being exploited simply to put more money in the pockets of those who are already rich. We would look at how the proletariat are seen as commodities or modes of production to benefit the bourgeoisie. So this is the idea that the proletariat often gets seen as nothing more than an object. Their humanity is ripped away from them and they become nothing more than a tool to make money and profit for the bourgeoisie. And we call that being a mode of production. They are simply in the factories producing the goods, working to the bone, not getting paid very much, just to put more money into the pockets of those that are already at the top of the hierarchy. And so they become a commodity, something to be bought and sold, something that is nothing more than an object. And there is that real sense of a lack of humanity here. We would explore how in a piece of literature the world is seen as capitalist and how it is really focused on profit. How you can look at some of the texts in the factories and how you can see it's really focused around that. Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, for example, is a really great novel that shows this. It shows those in a town called Milton really suffering every day at the hands of the factory owners. They are ill, they get fluff in their lungs from the work they do in the factory, and they get paid a pittance for it. And the factory owners are enjoying much more lavish lifestyles, refusing to accept that these are human beings they are hurting. And we would explore how the proletariat becomes alienated from themselves. And by that what we mean is that they start to lose their identity. They don't know who they are anymore. And there's a thing that we call false class consciousness. And this is where a lower class person has been told so many times, and they have been indoctrinated, almost brainwashed to believe that they will never amount to anything, that eventually they just accept it. They believe that. And that makes them very easy to control. So that's a little summary of Marxism theory. We also perhaps look a little bit at feminism. And again, I've done a little box, little summary for you that might be worth copying down or copy and pasting or however you're going to make it work for you. And again, this is looking at literature through a different lens, a different perspective. And feminist critics look at it and they try to look at how women are presented in literature. And often in these texts, women are being presented as inferior to men. And this links back to those first few slides where I was talking about the culture that we have in this society. And if you're constantly reading literature that's implying that women are inferior and subordinate to men, then that becomes part of your understanding of the world. And so we become trapped in this cycle because literature feeds into that. We look perhaps at how women are categorised and stereotyped, and we're going to do that a little bit more in a few slides' time. But women tend to be boxed into these particular ideas, and they don't seem to be able to just be who they are in literature, and that's one of the things that we look at. Women are often marginalised and othered in literary work, so they're often seen as less significant and less important. They become secondary to the men in the text. And if you look at these first 3 bullet points and think about some of the most famous fairy tales that exist, these are a really perfect example of them. So if we have a little look at Snow White, for example, in this fairy tale, she has to run away because she's incapable of standing up for things for herself. She comes along with these 7 dwarves who then take care of her. They have to protect her. They have to look after her because she can't manage it. Somehow she unfortunately manages to eat the poisoned apple, and only when a handsome prince comes along and kisses her, and only when he sees her in this sexualised manner, is she able to wake up from the poison and be free again. But that freedom actually means marrying the prince and being known as his wife, being second to him. So that's perhaps a good way to think about it. We look at some of the strong female characters that some texts try to present, and we try to decide whether we think they are successful or not, or whether they just gloss over patriarchal dominance. So for example, let's look at Hermione Granger in Harry Potter. So she's not the main character is male. He has Ron, also male. He's going up against Voldemort, who is also male. He has the antagonist of Draco Malfoy, who is also male. The head teacher of the school, Dumbledore, is also male. So many of the characters are male in this text. But it's okay because we have Hermione, and she's a strong, empowered woman. She's intelligent. She's able to stand up to people. She can hold her own. Except if we unpicked it further, we could argue there was a problem with that. Because at the end of it, what happens to Hermione? Well, she ends up married to Ron, settled down in the old life, second to him, not able perhaps to use her intelligence to the best of its ability, and she becomes kind of this secondary character to the whole thing. And that's perhaps arguably the same for Ginny Weasley in the text. We have this entire family that's very male dominated. We've got Ron, we've got Percy, we've got Fred, we've got George, we've got all these males. And then Ginny is the female. And what does her role seem to be? Well, it seems to be that she's there to be a sexual awakening for Harry. She is there so that he can feel some of those boy emotions of attraction to women. And that seems to be her biggest role in the text. So we might argue that they are strong female characters. You might think that that's very unfair of me to argue that Hermione is seen in this way. But you might say, actually, these female characters aren't as successful as we think they are. And we explore the difference between biological sex and gendered socialisation. And what I mean by that is that you have a biological body that categorises you as male or female, but you are socialised into believing that there are certain things that men do and certain things that women do. And we're going to look at that in a bit more detail now. So on this slide, I've mentioned somebody called Burtons. Now, he's a really, really good critic, and he wrote about feminist theory. And he says that women are often categorised, and he gives 4 possible examples that women are categorised into. And he says that they're the immoral and dangerous seductress, so the women who lure people in, who are presented in this very sexualised manner. They can often come across like that in literature. They are the eternally dissatisfied shrew, meaning they're the bad-tempered, aggressive, controlling female in the text that is not perhaps liked very well. They are cute but essentially helpless, so the very attractive, beautiful women, but they can't do anything for themselves. They need the man to come along and rescue them. And the self-sacrificing angel, the pure, perfect, angelic woman who ends up getting sacrificed because she was too innocent to do anything. So he comes up with these 4 different possible ways that women are presented. And here I've got those 4 possible ways, and I've got 6 characters from different texts. So some of them you might have heard of, some of them we've studied. We've got Lady Macbeth in the top middle there. We've got Eva Smith from An Inspector Calls. Then the top left, we've got Katniss Everdeen from The Hunger Games. Juliet at the bottom left. Curly's wife, bottom middle from Of Mice and Men. And Jane Eyre, bottom right. So what I would like you to do now is I would like you to research a bit about these texts if you don't know anything about some of them. And then I'd like you to decide what category or categories, because you might think some of them go into more than one, that these 6 female characters fit into of the 4 that we have just discussed. Make your own notes, and then when you're ready, click onto the next slide and we'll have a little talk through some possible ideas and interpretations. Okay, so let's have a look. Let's start with Lady Macbeth in the top middle. She perhaps falls into the eternally dissatisfied shrew category. So she is very assertive, she's very aggressive, quite dominant over Macbeth. She is quite critical of him when he says he feels guilty over what they have done. And she perhaps ends up falling on this kind of quite masculine scale. And I think this is what happens sometimes with these way women are presented, is that if they're this dissatisfied shrew, they almost become kind of so aggressive and so dominant that they become masculine. And I guess in today's society, I'm doing air quote marks here, they kind of border on butch sometimes. So she perhaps falls into that category. Then at the bottom middle, we've got Curly's wife. Maybe she falls into the immoral and dangerous seductress. She is very flirtatious. She kind of lures the men in on the rant. She wears the red lipstick and the red shoes. So she perhaps falls into this. Then we have Eva Smith at the top right from An Inspector Calls. Maybe we could say she's the cute but essentially helpless character. She needs rescuing in the Palace Theatre by Gerald, who has to kind of come along as her Prince Charming, rescue her, take care of her, put her up in this apartment. Perhaps we put her in the self-sacrificing box. She ends up dying at the end and is this kind of sacrificial lamb to show the Burlings and Gerald that they need to be better. In the bottom left, we have Juliet, a self-sacrificing angel here, determined to be with the love, because of course she cannot exist without a man by her side. She takes her own life so that they can be together in death. When we have Jane Eyre on the bottom right here, so a text about a seemingly quite strong woman. She has quite a lot to deal with in her childhood. Then she meets and falls in love with Rochester. Turns out that he has betrayed her by keeping his unstable wife in the attic. So although he asked Jane to marry him, he was already married. And then at the end, she ends up going back to Rochester. She's not able to fulfill her role as an independent woman. So perhaps there's this idea that she was feeling helpless without a man in her life and she had to go back to him. And then at the top left, we've got Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games. And she's perhaps a difficult one to place because I think she's supposed to come across as quite a strong, independent female. And I'm not saying that you can't read the text in that way, of course you can. But perhaps we can also say that she's not perhaps as strong as we first think. If you look at her life, she has a string of men that are there supporting her because she seems to only be able to get so far on her own. She's got Gale, she's got Peter, she's got Haymitch. Of course, she sacrifices herself for Prim in the opening of the first book. And perhaps there is an argument that she's got Gale and she's got Peter and she's leading both of these men on. So perhaps all of these texts can be looked through a different lens if we wanted to. Okay, so now we're going to have a bit of a go. You can have a go being a bit independent yourself. So on the following slide, there is an extract from a text called Copper Sun. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to read that extract. I would like you to make notes on how you think it can be seen through a Marxist or a feminist critic's eyes. So remember, you're going to read the text and then you're going to bullet point Marxism first. How in the text can you see somebody being used as an object for profit? How can you see them being exploited? How can you see it as a capitalist world? How can you see that the character becomes alienated from their identity, from themselves, because of what is going on in terms of the divide between the rich and the poor? And then for the same extract, have a little look through a feminist lens. How are the women othered in the text? How are they made to seem inferior? How are they dominated by men? How are they categorised? And have a little look at that as well. Take your time, read the extract, make your notes, and then when you click a few slides on, I will talk through some of the possible ideas that you might have. So this is the extract, read it through, make your notes, and then click on when you're ready, and I will talk you through some ideas that you could possibly have. So now you need to swap your pen colour. This is where you can add in a different colour some of the things that I say that maybe you missed to your own notes, and then when you bring those notes in, we'll be able to see your original ideas and then in a different colour how you've added some extra notes in. So if we start with Marxist criticism, then we can see in the text that Amari is treated as if she is an object. She is literally sold in the extract. She likens it herself to the market days that she used to go to when she was back home. So there's the sense that she is an object in a market being sold, that she is like cattle here being herded. There's kind of this animalistic idea of the slave auction that is going on. Of course, we read that they put the oil on them to try to ensure that their profit is improved, because the more money they can make, the more money the bourgeoisie and the rich get. So they tried to put the oil on them. You might have studied this in history, perhaps, in order to make them look more sellable. We're told that Amari trembled in the extract. So there is no care for her fear here, no care for her humanity, her feelings, her dignity. All of that is ripped from her because this is all about making money. This is a capitalist world focused on profit. We're told in the text that she wanted to die at just age 15, and this is a real example of her being alienated from herself. She doesn't know who she is anymore, to the point where she would rather not be alive because she has no identity. It's been taken from her. They strip her naked, which again helps to link to that idea of being an object for exploitation with that lack of dignity. And they put her in shackles, and there is no concern about the pain that they are causing her. In fact, there's a real sense of dehumanization that takes place here, because Amari ends up as a commodity, something to be sold rather than a person. Then if we looked at it from a feminist critic's point of view, we can see how she is inferior to men. We're told that during the time on the ship over here, we know that she's raped at least 3 times during that time. And that's because she is seen as subordinate to male domination. She is othered. She is seen as secondary because she is seen as nothing more than a sight for their pleasure rather than as a human being. And there's this really interesting part where she sees Bessa, who she was going to it seems that she was going to be with, that back home there was some kind of relationship between the two of them. And now suddenly she feels that she's not deserving of him. She talks about how she doesn't have her innocence anymore because of the rape that has taken place. And this is really interesting for 2 reasons. One, it shows us that sense of loss of identity again, that she no longer feels that she is the girl that she once was. But it also perhaps is yet another example of societal stereotypes. And that's the belief that a woman has to be pure in order to be deserving of a good man. And she feels ashamed that she's not. Why? Well, again, this is another cultural idea that you have to be innocent and a virgin in order to be deserving of the man that you are going to get. Okay, so another theory that we sometimes look at is queer theory, or sometimes it's called lesbian and gay theory. And this is another idea that you might want to jot down. You can see I've got the little pen picture there, or you might want to copy and paste it, print the PowerPoint, whatever works for you. So a queer theorist will look at a piece of literature and they might try and do some of the following things. So they might try and identify where there might be potential lesbian or gay relationships that have been glossed over, that have been ignored, and a queer theorist would try to spot those and try and unpick them and discuss them. They might try to explore homosexual aspects of mainstream literature that have previously been ignored. So books that have been around for a long, long time that nobody has ever picked up and thought about the fact that there might be an underlying homosexual relationship or aspect there. They look at how literature promotes the view, whether consciously or unconsciously, that heterosexuality is viewed as normative, it is normal, it is ordinary, whereas homosexuality is othered, it is often seen as corrupting or dangerous. And they explore gender spheres, and this links perhaps a little bit back to the feminism theory. They look at how there is a difference between your biological sex and the socialised roles of male and female, and how we are socialised into believing that males do a certain thing and females do a certain thing. And with that socialisation of gender, of thinking that males do something, females do something, alongside that becomes the socialisation of heterosexuality as the normal way forward and the normal relationship. So queer theorists look at all of this, and they look particularly at the context that's relevant behind it. So, for example, the idea of being homosexual was still illegal in this country all the way up to around 1967. So actually, it was illegal. You would go to prison, you could be hung for being a homosexual, and that context obviously comes into a lot of the literature that we read. We have what's called Section 28, which was a legal article brought in 1988 by Margaret Thatcher, and it banned the promotion of homosexuality. It wasn't allowed to be taught in schools, it wasn't allowed to be promoted in any way, shape or form. And perhaps the one that might make you take a little bit of notice more is that in this country it was only legal to have gay marriage in 2013. So we have only had gay marriage allowed in this country for 7 years, and there are many other places where this is still not legal. So they look at the kind of context and how this might have shaped some of the texts that we look at, and they try to take texts that don't seem to perhaps have any obvious homosexuality in them, and they look at perhaps the underlying ideas behind it. So for example, let's take Jekyll and Hyde. You've all had a look at it whilst you were in year 11. And a queer theorist might take this text and say that actually Hyde, the other side to Jekyll, is actually Jekyll's hidden homosexual side. And so by releasing him, he allows him to go out and to indulge in these activities. And you might sit there and think, well, there's no evidence of that. Well, perhaps a queer theorist would be able to find things for it. So, for example, there is only really men in the text of Jekyll and Hyde. It is a very male-dominated text, and they have this group. We know there's a group of them, that they all go to dinner together. We know that Utterson is in that group. We know that Dr. Lanyon and Jekyll, they're all in this kind of very manly group together. We know that Utterson has a nightmare in chapter 2 where he dreams about Hyde creeping into Jekyll's bed. We know that when he kills Sir Danvers in chapter 4, he beats him with his cane, and there's some kind of perhaps euphemistic imagery around that. We know that he admits at the very end of the text that when he was Hyde, he was able to engage in his most wicked and deepest pleasures and desires. So a queer theorist might take a text like that and try to identify the possible homosexuality in this. So on this slide we have two very famous theorists. So we have Simone de Beauvoir, who came up with a very famous quote, "One is not born but rather becomes a woman." And we have Judith Butler, who says that you become a male or female and heterosexuality becomes normal in your life because of what she calls identificatory practices. Now, what I'd like you to do is take your first colour, write down what your interpretation of those two quotes is, pause this induction lesson, and then when you're ready, go on to the next slide and I will talk you through perhaps some of the understanding of what these might mean. Okay, so grab that different coloured pen so when you bring this work in, we can see your ideas and then what I've talked you through. So the first quote, "One is not born but rather becomes a woman," is that idea of socialisation again, that you become a woman by doing what society tells you a woman does. She believes that you are, let's say, trained into womanhood, and it's to do with the habits and the things that you do. And of course, from that, one of the factors of becoming a woman is that you are expected to find a good man, a husband, have a heterosexual relationship and settle down. And Judith Butler in her quote has a similar sort of idea. What she calls identificatory practices are things that you do over and over again that are apparently womanly, that are the stereotypes of being a woman. So for example, there are lots of sports that we consider being male dominated. So if you play rugby, that's a very masculine and manly thing to do, and we're taught that as we're socialised. So we tend to have men play rugby rather than women. Not always, but it does seem to be leaning towards that way. There tends to be this idea that women are the chefs, or the cooks, or the bakers. And so we are socialised from a young age. How many children have those plastic kitchens that they can play with when they're little? That this is a female practice. We have childbirth and having a baby. It's seen as the norm for a woman to want to do that. And how do you have that baby? Well, you have a heterosexual relationship with a man, and that tends to be the way that it goes forward. Of course, not always, but that is the general socialisation. Males have this very kind of horny boy sex talk when they get to their teenagers, and a lot of it is all about talking about women in this way. And if you don't do that, then you're not seen to be following the normal pattern. And that pattern, those practices that you do time and time and time again, they make you a man or a woman, and therefore that's what you're being socialised into. Hopefully that makes sense. Don't worry, we're going to cover all of this a lot more, but this is just to give you some ideas right at the beginning. Okay, so now let's have a little look at an example of applying some of these ideas that we are socialised into our gender, and what happens if you take that away? What happens if you end up doing some of the practices of the opposite gender? What happens if you do some of the more masculine things? How does that skew your identity? And in particular, how does that perhaps skew that idea of heterosexuality being the norm? So we're going to look at a few extracts from a book, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. And this is about a young man who goes out to sea, very kind of masculine thing to do. But unfortunately, he becomes stranded on an island for a very long time, 15 years. And then he meets a man named Friday. and he makes him his slave. Now, after being on an island for that amount of time, of course, Robinson Crusoe has to figure out how he's going to take care of himself, and he's all alone. And then, of course, Friday comes along. So what I would like you to do is I'd like you to look at the next slide. These are all quotes from the book Robinson Crusoe. And I want you to look at how some of these might be skewing his gender identity, skewing the idea of heterosexuality. I want you to be a queer theorist and see if you can identify any homosexual ideas going on in the text, and kind of look at the quotes and see what you can unpick. Write that in that first colour again, have a good look, and then we'll go through it in a moment. So these are the key quotes, have a look through them, take your time, pause the PowerPoint, make your ideas and read them, and then when you're ready, go on to the next one and we'll talk through them. So let's have a look at some of the ideas. So pick up that second colour again to add your extra notes in a different colour. So what we have here is we have a real mix of masculine and feminine identificatory practices. So a real mix of Robinson Crusoe doing some things that are considered masculine and some things that are considered feminine. So for example, in the first quote we're told he goes and he kills the goat. So this is very kind of caveman, man, hunter, masculine kind of idea. We're told that he's got the fortress that he's been building, and the quote tells us about him driving the stakes into the ground. So again, that real sense of aggression and power, very masculine. We're told that he's got these pistols, the weapons, again, very masculine choice, and his carpentry that he's doing, the building that he is doing. And all of these we've been socialised to believe are more masculine traits. And that doesn't mean that they are, I'm simply saying that we've been socialised to view them in that way. But then if we look at some of the other quotes, we get some more feminine ideas coming through. So he talks about the parasol that he's made, the kitchen and the dresser that he's been working on. And these have connotations of very much being a homemaker, the kind of the woman's role in the home. He talks to us about the pottery that he's been making, the pots and the dishes, and then of course the baking that he's been doing, the loaves and the cakes and the very much more stereotypically feminine cooking that he's been looking at. And so again, I'm not saying that this is the way that it necessarily is, but these tend to be the stereotypes that we are fed. And so in terms of Robinson Crusoe's gender and sexual identity, there's going to perhaps be some confusion here because he's doing both the male and the female practices. So what kind of identity does he have? He hasn't had any women around him in order to help cement that idea of heterosexuality. And then Friday comes along. And if you look at the quote, and we're looking at it from a queer theorist perspective, he really focuses on this other man's appearance. He calls him handsome. He calls him well-made. He says he has strong limbs. He focuses in on his mouth, describing it as a very good mouth. He says that he is manly, so he does recognise that this is another man he's talking about, but he also describes Friday's sweetness and softness about him. And so there seems to be perhaps some confusion here because he's been out of society for so long, isolated on his own in this island, because he's been doing both the female and the male practices. There's perhaps some confusion in his sexual identity. And this description of Friday has a bit of a homosexual and arguably homoerotic undertone to it. The way he describes him perhaps has that attraction running through it. And then in the final one, Friday puts Robinson Crusoe's foot on his head, and there's this kind of moment of domination between them. So these are some ideas that it might be worth adding to your notes. So that's the main bit of theory that we've talked through. So we've looked at Marxism, the idea that the world is a capitalist world focused on profit, where people are exploited, the proletariat are alienated from themselves, they're othered, and they're a commodity that is used for profit. We've looked at feminism, the idea that perhaps texts present women in categories, in boxes, as the self-sacrificing angel or the seductress or the shrew. We've looked at how they often get othered, become secondary to the man, they are inferior to male domination. And we've looked at queer theory, having a look and seeing if there are some underlying homosexual relationships in a text. Perhaps that this is to do with your practices that you are looking at, and you are fulfilling, and that these perhaps end up skewing your understanding. So, summer work we are going to ask you to do is that both Dracula and The Picture of Dorian Gray are from the Gothic genre, and so the summer work that we are going to ask you to do is some research, some questions. It is about this idea of the Gothic, and so this should genuinely help you when you are reading these texts for next year. They should give you a head start. It should make sense when we're talking about Dracula as a Gothic text in lesson. So please do your very, very best with this. And finally, to finish off, and we've talked about this a little bit already in terms of feminism, I would just like your ideas, so not going to talk it through with you this time, but what would a Marxist, a feminist or a queer theorist say about Harry Potter? So we've touched on feminism a little bit, so you can go back over that, add some ideas. Think about the wizarding world for Marxism, just some hints to get you going. Think about pure blood wizards, and then you've got the half-bloods, and then you've got the muggles. How could that perhaps relate to the hierarchy of Marxism? Think about some of the perhaps queer interpretations, those wands that they are using in the text a lot. So you might have a bit of fun trying to unpick that. We very much hope that you enjoyed the online induction and that it made sense. Obviously, this is the best that we can give you at this moment in time. And we're very much looking forward to seeing lots and lots of you taking A-level English literature in the coming year. Thank you. Bye.